My name is Megan Carter. I'm 28 years old and I work in marketing. For as long as I can remember, I've been treated like a shadow in my own family, always standing behind my sister, the perfect daughter my parents placed all their hopes on. I kept telling myself that if I just endured long enough one day, they would finally see me. But then one small mistake pushed everything past the breaking point. The day before my sister's wedding, I accidentally left behind a box of decorations I had spent countless sleepless nights preparing. My mother looked at me, her voice cutting like a knife. Megan, the greatest gift you could give this family is to disappear forever. My father stayed silent, only nodding. I stood frozen, my heart tearing apart. Every slight from my childhood, every sacrifice that was never acknowledged, all of it crashed down in that single moment. And for the first time, I didn't cry. I didn't apologize. I said one sentence that made the entire room go still. What I spoke that day sparked a turning point no one expected. Not them, and not even me. And if you want to know what happened when I truly disappeared, keep listening to my story. I was 8 years old, and all I wanted was to make my parents proud. I remember one evening we were sitting around the dinner table. My father was reading through some work papers. My mother had just set down a dish of chicken, and Jessica, my older sister, was talking about her school day. My heart was racing because I had something special to share. I had won an art award at school that afternoon. It was just a certificate, nothing grand, but to me, it felt like proof that I could shine too. I waited for the right moment, holding the certificate carefully so it wouldn't bend. When the table grew quiet for a second, I pushed my plate aside and smiled. I said, "Look what I got today." I held it up proud and nervous, hoping their eyes would light up. My mother leaned closer, glanced at it for a second, and then, without missing a beat, she turned to Jessica and asked, "So how did the Math Olympiad go? Did you get the medal?" Jessica's face lit up as she pulled a small case from her backpack and showed off the gold medal. My mother clapped her hands and said with real excitement, "That's what I'm talking about. Real talent." Then she looked back at me for just a moment and said, "Cute hobby, but your sister got first in Math Olympics. That's real talent." The words hit me harder than she realised. It was not just that she brushed off my award, it was how quickly the pride left her voice when she spoke to me. My father looked over his glasses, gave a small smile but said nothing. He nodded in Jessica's direction, agreeing with my mother, as though that was the natural thing to do. I sat there frozen, my certificate trembling in my hands, my cheeks hot. I wanted to cry, but I swallowed it down. That night, while Jessica basked in their praise, I felt myself shrink a little smaller. Later, after the dishes were cleared, my mother leaned back in her chair and began to talk about her own past. She spoke of how she had once dreamed of going into business, maybe even running her own company, but life had gotten in the way. She said, "Jessica has what I never had. She has the drive. She can go further than I ever could." My heart ached as I listened, because I realised then that she did not see me as part of that dream. To her, I was simply safe, ordinary, not worth investing in. My father reached over and patted my shoulder lightly. He whispered, "Let it go, kiddo. Family harmony matters." It was meant to comfort me, but instead it taught me something else. It taught me that no one would step in to defend me, not even the person who was supposed to be my protector. So I began to learn silence. I began to tuck away my small victories to keep them to myself, because what was the point of sharing if all they brought me was dismissal? That night in my bedroom, I held the certificate against my chest and whispered, "I thought it mattered. Maybe it doesn't." My voice was so soft I could barely hear it, but it was the start of a lesson that would follow me for years. I was the child who could win an art contest and still be invisible at my own dinner table. From then on, whenever Jessica came home with another medal or trophy, the house would fill with laughter and pride, and I would sit quietly, watching from the corner, learning to accept my role in the shadows. This was not just a passing moment. It was the pattern of my childhood, and it shaped everything that came after. My mother poured her ambition into Jessica because she believed only success could protect our family's reputation. My father stayed quiet because he thought peace at the table was more important than fairness. And me, I learnt to stay small, to stay silent, and to expect nothing in return. That is how the shadow began. And that is why, years later, the words they spoke to me on my sister's wedding day did not come out of nowhere. They had been planted long before in nights like this, when a child's joy was pushed aside for someone else's triumph. Those seeds grew with me as I got older, and by the time I finished high school, they had taken root so deeply I could hardly imagine a life beyond serving my family. I remember graduation day, standing in my gown, holding my diploma with teachers and classmates, asking where I was headed next. Some said I had a good chance of getting into a college in the city, even encouraged me to take an internship one of their contacts had mentioned. For a moment, I let myself dream about it, about leaving Woodhaven behind and finding out who I could be if I stepped out of my sister's shadow. But when I got home, my mother was already waiting at the table. She smiled for a moment, then shook her head. She said Jessica already set the bar. You should save money. Stay close. Take classes here. She added, your father and I need you at the office anyway, and we cannot manage alone. My father nodded, as if that settled it. And just like that, the dream faded. I told myself it was fine that family came first, but the truth was, I had no choice. Not long after, I was offered an interview at a company in the city. I remember how excited I was, how I laid out my best clothes and practiced answers in the mirror. The morning of the interview, my mother called out that she felt dizzy again, that she needed to see the doctor immediately. She pressed her hand to her head, looked at me with sharp eyes, and said she could not drive herself. My father glanced up from his papers and said, Megan, you better take her. So I picked up the car keys, called the office, and cancelled the interview. By the time I got back home that evening, the opportunity had already slipped away, and I knew it would not come again. I swallowed the disappointment and told myself you did the right thing, family first. But a part of me wondered what might have been if I had chosen myself just once. Daily life settled into a pattern. I took classes at the local community college, but most afternoons and evenings were spent at the family firm. I filed papers, ran errands, and covered the reception desk whenever my parents needed a break. The work was endless and mostly thankless. My father would smile sometimes and say, "You are reliable, kiddo," but he never once asked if I was happy. He never noticed that every hour I spent in that office was another hour stolen from the life I might have had. My mother began leaning on me more and more, not only for her health appointments, but also for the finances. One evening she said, "It will be easier if we set up a joint account. That way, you can put money in for household costs, medical bills, things like that." I agreed because I thought it showed love that it proved my place in the family. Soon, my part-time paychecks and saving were going straight into that account, while Jessica's income from her internship stayed firmly in her own name. At first, I felt proud, but after a while, I realised it was just another way I was carrying the weight for everyone else. At the dinner table, the comparisons never stopped. My mother would beam when Jessica called home with news about her promotions and awards, and then she would turn to me and ask if I had finished filing those invoices or balanced the petty cash. Once I tried to talk about a project I had completed at the small agency where I worked part-time, but my mother brushed it aside and said, "That's nice, but Jessica is making real progress." The room would fall quiet and I would retreat into myself. My father would clear his throat, shift in his chair, but he never spoke up for me. At night, lying in my bed, I would think about the choices I had given up. I asked myself, over and over, if I give enough, if I sacrifice my time and my dreams, will they finally see me, will they finally be proud, or will it never be enough? The answer never came, and so I kept going, chained by the hope that one day they would look at me the way they looked at Jessica. That is what my youth became. Not a time of freedom or discovery, but a long list of duties, errands, and sacrifices. I was the one who stayed, the one who filled in the gaps, the one who gave without asking for anything back. They called it normal. They called it family. But to me, it felt like carrying a burden. I had never chosen one that only grew heavier with each passing year. That weight grew even more when my sister announced she was getting married. Jessica was working in the city, busy with her executive job, and my parents immediately said she had no time to plan a wedding. I heard my mother's words, and before I even thought about it, I offered to take care of everything. I wanted to believe that if I gave my all, if I made the day perfect, maybe they would finally look at me with pride instead of indifference. It felt like my last chance. From that moment on, the wedding became my life. I coordinated with vendors, searched for the right flowers, and studied menus until my eyes blurred. Every choice felt like a test. Would this please them? Would this finally make me enough? I stayed up late at night, hunched over my small desk with scraps of paper and pens scattered everywhere. One night, as I was writing out invitations by hand, I caught sight of myself in the mirror. My face was pale, my eyes tired, and yet I whispered to my reflection, "Just once, I want to hear you did well." The sound of my own voice startled me because I realised how much I was begging for something that had never come. Still, I pressed forward. I chose peonies for the centerpieces, because years earlier, Jessica had mentioned she liked them in a magazine. I called the caterer 3 times to make sure the roasted chicken was seasoned without garlic, since my mother was sensitive to it. I mapped out the guest list and tracked down addresses for people I barely knew, simply because my parents insisted they had to be invited. Every detail was deliberate, every step a silent plea for approval. But even as I worked, the cracks showed. My mother barely glanced at the plans, offering only sharp reminders that nothing short of perfection would do. My father flipped through the binder I had assembled and said, "Just don't drop the ball, kiddo." It was not encouragement, it was pressure. And then there was Jessica, who gave me one-word responses over text like, "Fine," or "whatever you think." She did not ask how I was managing. She did not thank me for the hours I poured into her wedding. She simply assumed I would do it the same way she had always assumed I would stand behind her. One afternoon, I overheard something that chilled me. My mother was speaking quietly to Susan, the photographer she had hired from church. She said, "If there's any slip, don't cover it. I want people to see." Her voice was calm but firm. In that moment, I understood that no matter how hard I tried, she was waiting for me to fail. The thought sat in my chest like a stone, but still I could not stop. I told myself, maybe if I go beyond perfect, she will have no choice but to recognize me. The days blurred together as the wedding drew closer. I spent money I had saved for myself on decorations and a necklace I knew Jessica would love. I skipped meals, ignored my own needs, and kept telling myself that this was not just about a wedding, it was about proving my worth. Each morning, I woke with a heavy knot of anxiety, but each night I forced myself to keep going. I imagined my parents smiling at me, maybe even telling me I had done a good job. That picture kept me moving, even when exhaustion pulled me down. Inside, though, I knew I was standing on fragile ground. My hope was like thin glass, shining but ready to shatter at the smallest crack. I tried to ignore the voice in my head that whispered, "They will never see you." I tried to drown it out with lists and schedules and late-night whispers to the mirror. Looking back, I can see how desperate I was. I was a grown woman, nearly 30, and still I was begging for approval from parents who had never given it. I was pouring everything into an event that was not even mine, believing it could rewrite the story of my life. I wanted to believe that this time would be different, that this burden might finally lead to acceptance instead of dismissal. But the truth is, I was setting myself up for heartbreak. Because behind the binders, the flowers, and the endless lists, my family was not waiting to thank me. They were waiting for me to stumble. They always had been. And when the moment came, they would make sure everyone saw it. That thought was heavy in my chest the night before the wedding when I carried the last boxes of decorations into my parents' house. The rooms were buzzing with voices and laughter, the smell of flowers and food filling the air, but all I felt was tension. I had worked for months, poured everything I had into this wedding, and I kept telling myself just one more night, hold it together. Maybe this will be enough. I set the boxes down carefully, but as I did, I noticed one was missing. My stomach clenched. I had left it at my apartment. It was not gone, just forgotten in the rush of loading everything. I opened my mouth to explain, but my mother's voice cut through the room like a knife. "Where are the rest of the decorations, Megan?" Her tone was not a question, it was an accusation. Susan, the photographer, was arranging flowers in the corner, but I saw her glance over her eyes sharp, as if she was waiting for this moment. I said, "I'll grab it, now I left one box behind." But before I could move, my mother slammed her hand on the counter. "You forgot. You are always screwing things up." Her face twisted with anger, and my father lifted his eyes from his coffee, his voice low but full of disappointment. "We've been patient, Megan, but this is too much." My throat tightened, my heart pounding as the words hit me like blows. Jessica stood by the stairs with David, her fiancé staring down at her shoes. She did not say a word. For years, I had held back my anger, swallowed my pain, begged silently for recognition. But in that moment, something shifted. My hands were shaking as I walked outside, lifted the missing box from my car and carried it back in. I set it down in the middle of the room, my voice steadier than I felt. This isn't about a box. It's about never being accepted. This is my final gift. I disappear, and don't expect me back. The silence that followed was louder than any shouting. My mother's eyes burned into me cold and satisfied. She had been waiting for this. Then she spoke, her voice slow and cutting. "The greatest gift for your sister's wedding would be if you just disappeared from our family permanently." My father nodded, saying nothing, but his agreement was clear. Jessica lifted her eyes for a second, then looked away again. Not one person stood up for me. My chest felt like it was collapsing, but beneath the hurt was something else, a strange calm, as if the truth had finally been spoken out loud. They did not want me. They never had. And I would not crawl for them anymore. I picked up my bag, turned toward the door and walked out. The sound of the door slamming behind me echoed through the house, like a closing chapter, sharp and final. I stood outside in the night air, shaking from head to toe, tears threatening but held back. My whole body ached, but my mind was clear for the first time in years. They had chosen their favourite, their shining star, and erased me without regret. But if this was their final gift, then mine would be even greater. I would give them exactly what they said they wanted. I would disappear. Those words kept circling in my head as I walked away from the house into the dark night. The air felt cold against my skin, but my chest burned with a strange clarity. For years I had begged for their love, bent myself into every shape to fit their vision, and now it was over. They had erased me, and I was ready to raise the version of me that lived only for them. When I reached my apartment, the place that had once been a small refuge, it felt suffocating. The table was covered with decorations and the stack of invitations I had spent nights creating. They looked like ghosts of a life I no longer wanted. I sat down and stared at them, remembering the hours of careful writing, the cuts on my fingers, from folding paper, the hope I had poured into each card. The hope that maybe, just maybe, someone would finally tell me I had done well. My hand shook as I gathered the stack, carried it outside to the small patch of gravel behind the building, and struck a match. As the flames spread and the smoke curled into the air, I whispered, "If I don't leave tonight, it will disappear forever." The fire crackled, and with it, I felt something inside me break free. By morning, I was ready to act. I called a real estate agent, known for fast cash sales. I did not care about the price. I cared about speed, The apartment was never truly mine anyway. It had always been just close enough to my parents' house so they could reach me whenever they wanted. A waiting room for their demands. Within days, I signed the papers and handed over the keys. The agent counted out an offer below market value, but I barely listened. All I wanted was out. With the apartment gone, I turned to my own identity. The name Megan Parker felt like chains tied to every insult and dismissal I had carried. I chose Elaine, my middle name, not as a disguise, but as a declaration. Elaine was someone who could breathe, someone who could walk into a new town and not flinch every time the phone rang. I set up new accounts under that name, spoke to a lawyer about freezing the old joint account my parents had used. And for the first time in my life, I felt a spark of control. Packing was harder than I thought. My closet and shelves were full of things that belonged to the life I was leaving behind. I made 3 piles: what to sell, what to donate, what to take. The sell and donate piles grew quickly. Furniture, books, clothes, even the couch I had once saved for with careful paychecks. I let them go without regret. The take pile stayed small. My laptop, a few outfits, the journal I had written in since college, and a necklace from my high school art teacher who had once told me I had real talent. Those were the only pieces that felt like mine, untouched by my family's judgment. The last night in the apartment, I walked from room to room, touching the walls, the counters, the windows. It was empty now, stripped of all the clutter, but instead of feeling sad, I felt lighter. This place had held so many nights of exhaustion and tears, but it had also been the space where I finally decided to choose myself. I stood in the doorway with my bag in hand and whispered. I gave them everything I could. Now I give myself permission to walk away. I stepped into the night, the streetlights casting a pale glow, and for the first time the darkness did not feel like a cage. It felt like an open road. I was no longer Megan, the invisible daughter, the family servant, the one who always came second. I was Elaine, a woman about to begin again. I did not know where the road would lead, or if the shadow of my family would follow me, but I knew this. I had chosen myself, and that choice was the beginning of freedom. The road led me south past towns that blurred together, past motels, where I slept with the curtains drawn tight, past long stretches of highway, where I played the same songs over and over, just to keep from thinking too much. After 3 days, I reached Tidewater, a small coastal town in South Carolina. The first thing I noticed was the air. It carried salt and warmth, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. I found a cottage for rent on the edge of town. It was weathered. The floor creaked, the windows stuck when I tried to open them, and the faucet in the bathroom leaked steadily. But when I stood in the empty living room, the sea breeze drifting in through the back door, I felt something I had never felt before. This place did not belong to my parents. It did not belong to my sister. It belonged to me. It was not perfect, but it was mine. That first evening, I walked down to the shoreline. The path was quiet, the grass brushing against my legs, until suddenly the ocean opened before me. The sight of it stopped me cold. The waves rolled in and out, endless and steady, and something inside me broke. I sank down into the sand, covered my face, and sobbed. All the tears I had swallowed for years, all the hurt I had buried came pouring out as the waves crashed against the shore. I cried for the little girl with the arts certificate who was told she was just a hobby. I cried for the young woman who gave up her future to drive her mother to appointments. I cried for the countless nights spent hoping for words of praise that never came. The ocean carried it all away, and for once I did not hold back. When I finally wiped my face, I realized I was not alone. A woman stood nearby, holding a paper cup of coffee, her curly hair blowing in the wind. She smiled gently and said, "Everyone who comes here carries wounds, but here wounds turn to scars, not chains." Her voice was kind, not prying, just matter of fact, as if she knew exactly why I was there. She told me her name was Maria, and that she owned a cafe in town. She handed me the coffee, said it was on the house, and walked with me back toward the path. That single sentence stayed with me the rest of the night. The next morning, I set up my laptop on the small table in the cottage. I had signed up for a freelance platform before leaving Woodhaven, not knowing if it would amount to anything. To my surprise, messages trickled in. Small projects at first, logos, simple marketing campaigns, nothing glamorous, but they were mine. Each one reminded me that my skills had value, that I could stand on my own without being told I was second best. With every email I sent, every payment that came through, I felt a piece of myself stitching back together. Days passed, and Tidewater began to feel like a rhythm I could live in. I walked the marsh trails in the morning, worked in the afternoons, and sometimes sat in Mariah's cafe in the evenings, listening to her chat with locals who treated me like I belonged, without asking for my history. They did not know my parents, they did not know Jessica. They did not see me as the afterthought. They saw me as Elaine, a woman who had simply arrived one day with tired eyes and a quiet smile. One evening, as the sun dropped low over the marsh and the sky glowed pink, I stood on the porch of my cottage looking out at the water. The air smelled of salt and pine, and I felt a calm I had never known. My voice was barely a whisper, but I heard myself say, "For the first time, I don't need permission to be free." The words startled me because they were true. My whole life I had asked for permission, begged for approval, lived by their rules. Now the only rules were mine, and the freedom of that thought was overwhelming. But even in this peace, a shadow lingered. My old phone, the one I had shoved into a drawer, buzzed one night with a text from an unknown number. I ignored it, but the sound reminded me that erasing the past is never as simple as walking away. For now, though, I let the silence return. I closed my eyes, listened to the ocean outside, and allowed myself to believe in the possibility of a life that was truly mine. This was the first light in Tidewater. It was not the end of my story, but the beginning of healing. I had come here with wounds, and maybe they could become scars instead of chains. That hope carried me through my first weeks in Tidewater, but the peace I found did not last. One morning, I was sitting in Mariah's cafe, working on a small project for a client, when I heard two women at the next table whispering. One leaned in close to the other and said, "Did you hear about that woman from Woodhaven, the one who stole money from her family and ran away?" My hands froze on the keyboard. The words sliced through me. I did not look up, but I felt my whole body tighten. They were talking about me. Even here, miles away from Kansas, my family had found a way to poison the air I breathed. I left the cafe early and walked quickly back to my cottage, my thoughts racing. I opened my old phone, the one I kept hidden in the drawer, and sure enough, the notifications were there. Posts on community boards, comments from people I barely remembered, all repeating the same story. Megan Parker stole money, abandoned. Her sick mother left her family to struggle. My heart pounded as I scrolled, seeing my mother's words quoted in local news articles. Patricia was telling anyone who would listen that I had drained family accounts and vanished without a trace. My father's name appeared too, his comments short but sharp, confirming her story. It felt like a second exile, only this time they wanted the whole world to believe I was the villain. The lies had consequences. That same afternoon, I got an email from a client in another state who said, "We're putting our project on hold until things are sorted out." Another message arrived an hour later apologising, but saying they could not work with someone unreliable. My throat closed as I read them. This was my work, my survival, and they were tearing it apart with words. That night, I sat in the dark of the cottage, staring at the screen of my laptop without moving. I had thought disappearing would end their control, but now I realised they were reaching farther than I ever imagined. Then came the final blow. My phone buzzed with a voicemail. It was my mother's voice, weak and trembling. "Megan. I'm in the hospital. I may not make it. Please come home." I froze, my chest aching with guilt. For a moment I almost believed her. But then I remembered how many times she had used her dizzy spells, her complaints, her fragile tone to pull me back under her control. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Not again." The next day, Maria noticed my pale face when I came into the cafe. She asked family trouble. I managed a nod. She did not push, but she looked at me with quiet understanding. Later that afternoon, one of my newer clients called. He sounded uneasy and said, "Someone was asking questions about you, a man with a notebook who said he was a private investigator." My stomach dropped. It was my father. Michael, the man who always stayed in the background, had now taken action. He had hired someone to track me down. His silence had become pursuit. Even in Tidewater, the whispers grew louder. Some locals looked at me differently after reading the rumours online. A landlord hesitated when I asked about renewing my lease, saying he wanted to be sure I was trustworthy. The words stung. This town had felt like a place for healing, but now the lies were seeping in here too. My sanctuary was not safe. That night I sat on the porch of my cottage with the ocean in front of me, the waves rolling in steadying calm while my mind churned. I thought about everything I had done to break free. I had burned the invitation sold, my apartment changed my name, I had crossed state lines and built a new life with my own hands. And yet, here I was, still shackled by the weight of their lies. My mother was spinning her sickness like a net. My father was sending strangers to hunt me down, and the town I had hoped would accept me was starting to question if I belonged. The fear was sharp, but underneath it burned anger. I had spent my whole life being silenced, being pushed aside, being told I was not enough. Now they wanted to erase me completely, to turn me into the thief, the traitor, the selfish daughter who abandoned them. My hands gripped the railing of the porch until they hurt. I whispered into the night, "Will I ever be free of them?" The waves gave no answer, but the question hung in the air. Inside, I lay awake for hours, my mind torn between two paths. One was to stay silent, keep hiding, let the lies spread while I shrank smaller and smaller. The other was to fight to speak the truth, to stop running. I was not ready to choose not yet, but I knew something had to change. Silence was no longer protecting me. The very next morning, the silence broke on its own. I opened my email, and there it was, a message from Jessica with the subject line, "I'm sorry." My hands hovered over the keyboard before I clicked. The words were short, written in the flat tone of someone who did not want to say much. She wrote that things had gotten out of hand, that everyone was under stress, that maybe she should have spoken up sooner. But then she added, "We're family, we can fix this if you come home." I read the message once, then again and again. My chest tightened each time. She said she was sorry, but she never admitted what they had done, never said she was wrong for standing silent when I was cast out. It was more like an excuse wrapped in soft words. Still, I could not let it go. I thought about the sister I used to hope for, the one I wanted to believe was somewhere inside her. Was this email proof that she still cared, or was it just another rope to pull me back into the same trap? I stared at the screen until my eyes blurred, caught between the longing to believe and the fear of being fooled again. What I did not know then was that my father had tried to reach me too. Michael had written a letter in his own shaky handwriting. He confessed that he had failed me, that he had stood by while my mother and Jessica pushed me aside. He wrote that he regretted it, that he wished he had been braver, that he did not know how to fix the years he had lost. He even wrote the words, "I do love you, even if I never showed it." Those words never reached me because my mother found the letter before it could leave the house. Patricia tore it apart, furious at his weakness, furious that he might give me hope. She told herself she was protecting the family, but the truth was she could not stand the thought of me being right about them. All I knew was what came through my inbox. Jessica's vague apology, the same silence from my father. More lies spreading online. I closed my laptop, leaned back in my chair and pressed my hands over my face. My mind kept circling. Could they finally be breaking? Could there still be humanity left in them? Or was this just another performance, another way to pull me back into the role of the unwanted daughter? That evening, I sat across from Maria at her cafe. I did not tell her everything, but I mentioned that someone in my family had reached out saying they were sorry. Maria set down the coffee pot, looked me in the eye and said, "People show you who they are in silence, as much as in words. Don't forget who stayed quiet when you needed them most." Her words landed heavy in my chest. She was right, but the ache inside me did not disappear. I still wanted to believe, even when believing had cost me so much. Back in the cottage, I opened Jessica's email again. I read the lines until I could hear her voice in my head. I pictured her sitting at a desk in the city, typing quickly before going back to her perfect life. I hovered over the reply button. My fingers twitched on the keys, but I could not type a single word. I wanted to believe there was still some love there. I wanted to believe my family was capable of change. But I also knew that believing might be the very thing that destroyed me. I shut the laptop, sat in the quiet and let the war inside me rage on. Hope against suspicion. Love against survival. A daughter's longing against a woman's resolve. The voices from the past were calling to me, and I did not yet know if I was strong enough to stay silent or brave enough to answer. The next morning, I woke with a heaviness in my chest and knew I could not keep living like this. My family's lies were spreading like wildfire, burning through everything I had tried to build. If I stayed silent, they would erase me completely. I whispered to myself, if I let them write my story, then I vanish for real. I would rather fight and lose than disappear without a sound. I called Stephen, the lawyer I had trusted, when I first froze the accounts. He answered quickly, and I told him I was ready to act. He listened, then said, "Megan, the truth is on your side. But truth only matters if you show it. Bring me every record you still have." That afternoon, I sat at my small kitchen table in Tidewater and pulled out the files I had carried with me. Bank statements showing my deposits receipts for medical bills. I had covered proof that the money in the joint account came mostly from me. For years, I had been their safety net, and now I had the paper trail to prove it. Stephen helped me prepare a package for the local press. He explained that once the documents were public, my parents could not claim I had stolen from them. They could spin it, they could scream about betrayal, but the numbers would speak louder than their words. Together, we contacted a reporter from Tidewater and another from Woodhaven. I watched as the evidence I had guarded for so long was scanned, emailed, and sent into the world. My hands shook as I hit send, but in that moment I felt lighter. The lies would no longer stand unchallenged. That night I opened my laptop again, but this time it was not to wait for another blow from them. It was to send a message of my own. I wrote to Jessica. I kept it short. "You've been silent too long. If you want to keep your humanity, tell the truth." I stared at the words before clicking send. My heart pounded, but there was no turning back. For the first time, I was not begging for her love. I was demanding her honesty. The hours that followed were endless. I refreshed my inbox again and again. Nothing. Midnight came and went. I closed the computer and tried to sleep, but every sound outside the cottage made me stir. By morning, there was still no reply. I brewed coffee, sat on the porch, and tried to tell myself it was foolish to hope. Then my phone buzzed with a notification. I opened it and froze. Jessica had posted publicly. Her words were simple, but they cut through years of silence. It wasn't Megan who failed the family. It was me. She carried the burden for years while I stayed away. I read it over and over, my eyes stinging with tears. My sister, the one who had stood by in silence, had finally spoken the truth. The impact was immediate. The local paper ran a piece combining Jessica's confession with the financial records Stephen had released. For the first time, people saw the real picture. I had been the one paying bills, arranging care, holding the family together, while Jessica built her career in the city. The story painted Patricia not as the victim she claimed to be, but as the mother who had lied to her community and smeared the daughter who sacrificed for her. I imagined Patricia sitting at the kitchen table back in Woodhaven, the newspaper spread in front of her, Jessica's words glowing on the screen. For once, she could not twist the story to her advantage. she could not silence me. I knew her well enough to imagine the fury in her eyes, the way she would slam her hand on the counter and hiss about betrayal. But beneath the rage, I also imagined something else shock. She had never believed Jessica would break ranks. And then there was my father. I pictured Michael in his chair reading the same words. Guilt was the one expression I had seen flicker across his face when he thought no one was looking, and now it would consume him. He had watched silently for years, nodding along to every cruel word my mother spoke. Now he would have to face that his silence had become a lie, and that lie had been exposed. As for me, I sat in my small cottage in Tidewater, staring at Jessica's post on the screen. For the first time, the truth was no longer hidden. For the first time, I was not invisible. My fear had not vanished, but it no longer held me by the throat. I was not the victim anymore. I was the fighter who had taken back her voice. The weight of that truth carried me through the days that followed, but I could feel the tremors of what it meant. My family's grip on the story was slipping, and the consequences were spreading faster than even I expected. It started with the papers in Woodhaven. I saw the articles online, headlines that made me stare in disbelief. Daughter carried the burden, family lies exposed. The same town that once praised Patricia and Michael for their perfect home and successful daughters was now reading about the truth they had buried. There were photos of them at a community event, Patricia in one of her pressed blouses, Michael at her side, but the smiles looked strained. The caption beneath read, "Once respected business owners now facing questions." I scrolled through comments, neighbours who had once praised my parents, now whispering about their deceit. For the first time in my life, the story was not written against me. The backlash spread quickly. The accounting firm my parents had built, the one that had been a pillar in town for decades, began to lose clients. Long-time customers called in to cancel. Others demanded explanations. Patricia tried to hold her head high, but word came back to me through acquaintances that charity committees had quietly removed her from event rosters, that church leaders had stopped calling on Michael to handle their finances. The polished image of reliability they had guarded so carefully was crumbling. One Sunday, Patricia stood up in church to defend herself. She claimed the articles were lies, that Jessica had been manipulated, that I had twisted everything to get attention. But her voice cracked, and when she looked around the sanctuary, no one stood beside her. Some people lowered their eyes. Others turned away. For Patricia, who had always thrived on control, that moment must have cut deeper than any insult. The community no longer believed her. For the first time, she was powerless. And then there was my father. Michael had always been the quiet one, the shadow behind her voice. I imagined him sitting in the pews that day, shoulders hunched, eyes on the floor, while Patricia fought to hold on. He did not rise to defend her. He did not raise his voice against me. His silence was heavy, but it was no longer the silence of agreement. It was the silence of shame. He knew his years of standing by had finally been laid bare for everyone to see. From Tidewater, I watched it unfold. Old acquaintances from Woodhaven reached out, some through email, some through messages on social media. They wrote things like, "We had no idea what you went through," or "I'm sorry, we never noticed." Their words were kind, but I could not help feeling a hollow ache. Where were those eyes when I was a girl begging for attention at the dinner table? Where were those voices when I was sacrificing my youth to keep my family afloat? Their apologies could not restore the years I had lost. Still, I felt something I had never known before: vindication. For once, the truth was louder than the lies. For once, the world could see what I had lived through. I sat in my small cottage, staring at the headlines, my hands trembling. It was not triumph in the sense of victory over an enemy. It was the quiet relief of finally being seen. But beneath that relief came another question, one I could not shake. Could they ever change? Would losing their standing in the community, their carefully built reputation, finally break through the wall of denial? Or would it only harden them deeper, make them cling tighter to the story that I was the problem, that I was the enemy who betrayed them. I thought about Patricia, her pride, her unyielding control. I thought about Michael, his silence that had become his shield. And I realized that even with the truth out in the open, I might never get the family I once longed for. That night, as the ocean whispered outside my window, I let the question settle inside me. I could not control whether they changed. I could not force them to see what they had done. What I could control was my own life, my own healing, the choices I made from this moment forward. For the first time, I had proof that the truth could survive without their permission. For the first time, I felt like I could breathe without carrying their weight on my shoulders. That breath of freedom lingered with me in the days that followed. It was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, and for the first time in years, I wanted to fill that space not with fear, but with something of my own. One afternoon, I opened the old box I had kept tucked away in the corner of the cottage. Inside was a worn sketchbook and a small tin of paints I had carried with me from Woodhaven, but never dared to open. My hands trembled a little as I lifted the lid. I could almost hear my mother's voice calling art a hobby, a distraction, nothing to be proud of. For a moment I froze, but then I reminded myself that voice no longer ruled me. Slowly, I pulled out a brush, dipped it in water, and pressed the bristles into the colours. The first stroke on the canvas was shaky, uneven, but it was mine. The room was quiet, except for the sound of the waves outside and the scratch of the brush against the canvas. As the image began to form, I felt something inside me loosen. In the evenings, Maria invited me to join her book club. At first, I hesitated, afraid of being the outsider again, but she smiled and said, "Everyone here knows what it means to start over." So, I went. We gathered in the cafe after hours, a handful of women from town sharing wine and laughter, talking about stories that had nothing to do with me or my family. For the first time in a long while, I laughed without holding back. No one compared me to anyone else. No one told me I was not enough. My voice was just another voice at the table, and it was heard. Back at the cottage, I kept painting. Day after day, I returned to the canvas, pouring into it the feelings I had carried for years. Slowly, the figure of a woman emerged. She stood with one foot in the shadows and the other reaching into the light. Her face was tilted upward, eyes closed, as if feeling the warmth for the first time. I realized she was me, the part of me that had been buried under silence and judgment, now stepping forward into her own life. When the painting was finished, I almost hid it away, afraid to let anyone see. But Maria visited the cottage one morning, her sharp eyes catching the canvas propped against the wall. She walked over, studied it in silence, then turned to me with a soft smile. "This belongs where people can see it," she said. At first, I shook my head, insisting it was nothing, just a way to keep my hands busy, but she would not let it go. By that evening, the painting hung on the wall of her cafe, above a corner table near the window. The first time I walked in and saw it there, I felt my breath catch. People glanced at it as they sipped their coffee, some leaning closer to study the colours, others asking Maria, who had painted it. A few even looked at me and smiled knowingly. My face flushed with heat, but inside me there was pride. For once, I was not invisible. For once, I did not have to beg for someone else to see me. The proof was on the wall, a piece of me that no one could dismiss. Standing in front of the painting, I let myself remember all the years I had wasted waiting for my family to tell me I mattered. I thought about the nights I had worked until dawn on invitations and decorations, dreaming that my mother might say, "You did well." I thought about the dinners where I had been scolded for being selfish, while Jessica was praised for her brilliance. I thought about the countless times I had silenced myself just to keep the peace. And then I looked at the figure on the canvas stepping out of the shadows into the light, and I realized I no longer needed their voices. I could see it for myself. In that moment, I felt something shift deep inside me. The girl who had once been the afterthought, the one always told to move aside, had grown into a woman who could create, who could speak, who could stand in her own truth. And that truth was no longer tied to Woodhaven. It was here in this small town by the sea, in the laughter of new friends, in the strokes of paint on canvas, in the quiet pride of knowing my life belonged to me. The cafe grew quieter as the evening went on, the painting glowing softly in the lamplight. I sat with Maria, sipping tea, and she leaned over to whisper, "You're not hiding anymore. You've stepped out." Her words wrapped around me like a gentle embrace. I smiled because she was right. I had not disappeared. I had appeared fully for the first time. That truth settled into me like sunlight warming my skin, but the world has a way of testing you when you think you are safe. A few mornings later, as the cafe was opening and Maria was humming behind the counter, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I almost let it ring out, but something told me to answer. I lifted it to my ear, and before I could speak, I heard her voice. Patricia, my mother. Sharp, but cracked in a way I had never heard before. She said I had destroyed the family, that I had humiliated them, that people were turning their backs, and it was my fault. Then her tone shifted softer, pleading. She said she was sick, that they needed me, that it was time to come home. I closed my eyes and listened. I let her words wash over me, not rushing to answer. Once they would have pierced me, sent me running, drowning in guilt, but not anymore. My voice was calm when I finally spoke. You wanted me gone. Now I'm gone. But am still alive, just not in your world anymore. The silence on the other end stretched for a long moment, heavy, almost trembling. Then the line went dead. I lowered the phone and set it on the table. I felt no panic, no guilt, only relief. Her voice no longer had chains for me. She had no power. That afternoon, Maria helped me hang my painting in its final place on the cafe wall. We chose the spot near the window, where the morning light would strike it first. The canvas showed the woman stepping out of the shadows into the light. Her face lifted, her body strong. As the sun streamed across it, the colours seemed to glow. People came in for their coffee, paused and turned to look. A few whispered how beautiful it was. One man asked if it was for sale, but I shook my head. This was not for money. This was my story, and it belonged here. I stood in front of it, heart steady, and thought about the years behind me. The girl who had begged for approval at the dinner table, the young woman who had sacrificed her future to serve her parents, the sister who had worked herself to the bone to make a wedding flawless in the hope of being noticed. That girl had been erased again and again. But the woman on the canvas and the woman standing before it now could no longer be erased. Maria came to stand beside me, resting her hand lightly on my arm. You know, she said softly, this painting doesn't just belong to you. It belongs to everyone who needs to remember they can step into the light. I swallowed hard tears pricking my eyes because I knew she was right. This was bigger than me now. I thought about Jessica, about her confession online, about the fragile bridge she had built by speaking the truth at last. I did not know if we would ever rebuild more than that, but I also knew it was not my burden to carry anymore. The choice was hers, and I was free either way. I thought about my father, his silence cracking under guilt, and I knew his choices were his alone too. And I thought about Patricia, her final call, her voice breaking between anger and desperation. For the first time, I felt no duty to fix her, no pull to heal what she had broken. The cafe grew quieter as the day went on. Sunlight streamed across the painting shadows, shifting slowly across the floor. I stood tall, my hands resting at my sides, my heart full of something I had never truly known before, peace. I turned once more to the canvas, to the woman stepping out of the darkness, and I spoke the words aloud, steady and clear. I didn't disappear. I just finally appeared in my own life. And maybe, as you've listened, you've felt pieces of your own story echoing inside mine. Many of us know what it's like to feel unseen, to carry burdens that were never fully acknowledged, or to walk through years of silence hoping for love that never came. It is painful and it leaves marks. But pain does not have to be the end of our story. What I've learned is that healing often comes in the small choices we make each day. For some, it's writing in a journal to put feelings into words. For others, it's painting music or simply walking by the water and letting the rhythm of the waves calm the heart. Some find comfort in therapy, some in prayer, and some in circles of friends who truly listen without judgment. Healing doesn't mean forgetting the past. It means learning that the past doesn't define who you are today. If you are carrying pain, I want you to know you're not alone. There are ways forward, even if they begin as the smallest steps. And just like the woman in my painting, you too can step into the light of your own life in your own time and in your own way. Thank you for walking through this journey with me. If the story touched you, stay with us. More voices, more stories, more truths are waiting. You can subscribe not because you have to, but because sometimes hearing that you are not alone is the beginning of healing. And if you choose to return, it will be here ready to share the next story with you.